on this episode of Jeff Does Vegas.
I was blown away that there was now a genre, I guess is the right way to say it, or a title for this kind of music. It wasn't just soft rock. It was cooler than soft rock. This is yacht rock, right? Like this is like you're envisioning, you know, hanging out in the summer in the Hamptons on a boat, you know, blasting Christopher Cross.
Las Vegas. It's more than just a city. It's a feeling. It's that feeling of excitement when you spot the lights of the Strip out the airplane window. It's that feeling of awe as you stroll down the boulevard, taking in the sights and sounds. And it's that feeling of satisfaction, knowing that you're in the greatest city in the world. Over 42 million people from around the world share that feeling every year. And I'm one of them. Taking you to the world-famous Vegas Strip and beyond, my name is Jeff, and this is Jeff Does Vegas. Okay, so I need you to do something for me here. Close your eyes and imagine it's the early 1980s. You're sitting in the captain's chair, cruising the Atlantic shores of the Hamptons with your friends. The bikinis are fluorescent, the shirt collars are popped, and boat shoes are being worn sockless. Your vessel's sound system is pumping out the soft rock vibes of the likes of Toto, Kenny Loggins, Michael McDonald, Christopher Cross, and Air Supply. That, my friends, is yacht rock. And that is what Las Vegas headliners, the Docksiders, are all about. Joining me for this episode of the podcast is the founder of the Docksiders, Kevin Suker. Kevin is a longtime music industry vet who's worked with some pretty heavy hitters in the business, including the likes of Stevie Wonder, Train, Michelle Branch, Gwen Stefani, and David Foster. Back in 2017, after an almost 20-year absence from performing, Kevin had an idea for a show that celebrated the music known as yacht rock. He put together a band, hit the stage, and after touring the show around his home area in the Midwest, he connected with one of his longtime idols who told him, "You have to bring this show to Vegas." And the rest, as they say, is history. In addition to all the Docksiders lore and history, Kevin and I had a great in-depth conversation about the current state of the music industry and what it might hold in the future. Kevin also shared the story of his first ever visit to my hometown of Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, back in the early 1990s, and the uniquely Winnipeg experience he got to be a part of. Please enjoy my conversation with Kevin Suker of the Docksiders.
I grew up just north of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In a little city. Well, it's not so little, but it's a northern suburb called Mequon, about 20 minutes north of the city. A really beautiful community, very manicured lawns, and I'm a child of a very middle class family. My father worked very, very hard and was the primary breadwinner. My mom was a stay-at-home mother, and I couldn't have had two better parents. I'm very fortunate that they're still with us, and they are my biggest fans and the biggest supporters. And as a kid that had a passion for the arts, I started in musical theater, and that progressed through, learning how to play keyboards and guitar and writing songs, and that's what's taken me in my career. But my parents, still to this day, my dad's 81, my mom's 77. And they won't miss a show as long as it's they can get there relatively easy. They still come.
I don't know an awful lot about Milwaukee and Wisconsin and that area. Is that a big music city? Are there a lot of bands and a lot of artists that have come out of Milwaukee? Does it have a really big musical scene?
I think for the city, it has a pretty significant scene. It always felt like we were, the forgotten about musical community. I remember being a young kid trying to get recognized and trying to, make a name for myself in town. And it felt like bands in Chicago, which was about 100 miles away, and bands in Minneapolis, which was about 5 hours away, obviously with Prince and all the other great music that came out of the Twin Cities. We were like sandwiched in between, and it kind of, it was almost like the same thing when big tours would be out on the road. Milwaukee would oftentimes get skipped because it wasn't really a major market like Minneapolis was or like Chicago was. So a lot of times they would say, why are we going to play, 100 miles away when, maybe half the audience would be coming from Milwaukee anyways. So it was an interesting community. And I've lived, what I can comment about Milwaukee is obviously I lived a large portion of my life there. And I lived in LA for a while. I lived in New York for a while, and now I've lived in Vegas. And looking back on all the places that I've lived, Milwaukee was definitely the most challenging musical community that I've ever been a part of. Not a lot of support between musicians. Vegas, we can get to that a little bit later, is very, very different. In a very strange way, you'd think Milwaukee being like kind of a smaller town, maybe the community would be a little bit more tight knit, but it really wasn't. And also, I think I came up in an era where live music was everything in the world, like in the 80s, and even in the 90s for the most part. But then like the late 90s happened, and the DJs became more popular than kids like sitting in their rooms woodshedding and learning how to play guitars. And live music venues in Milwaukee started going away, and it became much more difficult to gig if you weren't known. And thankfully, at that point in time, I'd made a name for myself outside of Milwaukee, which then helped kind of the whole Milwaukee recognition thing be a little different.
I'm somewhat familiar with that dynamic of the smaller city getting skipped over for the big tours. I grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And so it was always heartbreaking whenever the tours would come through and the bands would come through. And I mean, it's always hilarious enough when a band says they're doing a Canadian tour, and by Canadian tour, they mean Vancouver and Toronto. That's the only places they're going.
Right.
And it was always kind of heartbreaking when these bands would skip Winnipeg. And I think Winnipeg is similar to Milwaukee in that it had that almost like an underground music scene. I mean, there were a lot of big bands in the 60s and 70s that came out of Winnipeg with the likes of the Guess Who and BTO and bands like that. But I think the big musical scene in Canada was really Toronto and Vancouver. Sure. So it's very similar. It sounds very similar dynamic to what I sort of grew up dealing with.
Very cool. It was the first city I ever visited when I got to Canada for the first time was Winnipeg.
I'm sorry. I apologize for that.
You're sounding like a true Canadian, always apologizing. You don't have to with me. I have a crazy story about Winnipeg. Our car was towed. We were very young, and we were playing in Grand Forks, North Dakota on tour, and we had a day off. Actually, it was a show day, but we thought we had enough time to get from Grand Forks, North Dakota to Winnipeg and back and still play a show that night. And it would have worked out had our van not been towed. We parked on some street by a mall, and when we came out, there were 100 cars that were gone, and ours was one of them. So we had to try to figure out how to get it back and who had $300 to get it out of the pound. It was a nightmare.
That story could not be more Winnipeg if it tried to be, quite honestly. I don't know if you can actually call yourself a Winnipegger if you haven't had your vehicle towed out of one of those towaway zones. Total side story, not related to anything here with that other than a Winnipeg story. I know so many people that would park downtown areas in Winnipeg and all this stuff, and it was like 3:30 to 5:30. It was no parking on any of the downtown streets. Yeah. And there were parking lots where there were tow trucks that would stage, and the drivers would be sitting there looking at their watches, waiting. And when that thing hit 3:30, boom, they were out taking away cars.
I think I was 19 years old, and we were there, and we decided we wanted to experience Canada. None of us had been, and we were like, what should we do that could be Canadian? Well, we got to try some Canadian food. That was the thing that we thought. So we drove to some giant shopping mall. It was like this was 1991. And literally we parked with hundreds of cars on the street. And when we came out, hundreds of cars were gone. I mean, it was including ours. We were like, did we park here? Yeah, we did park on this street. And then it was like, could the car have been towed? And sure enough, we looked at a sign, and I think you were right. Something between 3:30 and 5:30. They were like, we will tow the heck out of your car. And then we were like, I think we were 4 hours away. It was a long drive. It was not close. And we were late getting to the gig because we had to get a cab to take us to the Pound, and none of us had cash. We weren't making enough money back then to even have an extra $300-400 to try to get the car out. But that was my Winnipeg experience.
I'm going to get you a certificate making you an honorary Winnipegger for having your car towed during rush hour.
I love it.
Downtown. It's just that happens.
So fun. That's great.
It's amazing. Did you study music in university or college? Did you go to college or university for music?
I didn't. I'm completely self-taught musician. I'm an instinct person, and I know a bunch of people like me. Like, I thought I was odd growing up. I heard music very differently than a lot of other people. I just heard Lionel Richie give an answer about how to tell if you're a songwriter. And he started pounding on his leg, just a 4 count. And he said, if you just hear the slap on my leg, you're not a songwriter. But if you can hear a melody or a lyric or a rhythmic progression along with what you're hearing on that 4-beat pulse, you're a songwriter. And my parents used to tell me that they would put on records when I would be 2, 3, 4 years old, and I would stand like face to face with the bookshelf speakers, and I would shake back and forth, or I would move to the beat. But they were like, they would say I was transfixed on the speaker. And I remember being 7 or 8 years old, and my grandparents lived in New York, and I would visit them in the holidays and in summers. And Tony Orlando's single "Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree" was a huge, huge favorite song of mine. And I remember my grandfather telling me, like, I have to stop playing. Kevin, you have to stop playing the record because you are wearing out the needle. And I didn't know what that meant at the time, but like 100% self-taught. And to this day, I remember going through some music theory classes in high school. And I had such a chord vocabulary just being a writer, and I understood inversions and musical changes and key changes and time signatures. I just understood them. But the theory class put the definitions and the names to what I had learned by just studying the radio. In my shows, I talk about Casey Kasem's Top 40 was my master class, and I used to sit at 10 years old and write all 40 songs in spiral notebooks from week to week. And then in my 10-year-old brain, I would try to figure out why certain songs would move up the chart or down the charts. And I don't know if I was right or wrong or what it is, but I did try to take some formal piano lessons. And I remember the teacher starting with like "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." And I was like, listen, lady, I want to play Jump by Van Halen. Like, this is not interesting at all to me. Like, if you can't teach me how to boogie woogie and like solo and improvise in some rock and roll progression, like, I'm not interested. And my dad still to this day would be like, they still owe me a rebate of like $150 because you didn't go to another lesson after that. I was like, that was me. So, yeah, very, very, I have a unique ability to hear things. There's a movie that Mark Ruffalo is in called Begin Again. It's a movie about music and a writer, and he's like a failing record executive. And there's this one scene where he's in a bar and they're listening to this young woman play, the other star in the movie. I can't remember her name right now, but he's looking up on the stage and he sees all the other instruments being played by nobody. But he's hearing the production of the record and how to make things go. That's the blessing and the curse that I have. I listen to music just very differently than a lot of people. It seems that the music of my youth is really the only music that can take me back to a place. I think, anything past the age of 20, I get too analytical, and I listen very, very detailed, but very analytically. I'm always deconstructing. I'm always figuring out how it was recorded. I'm always figuring out, like what could have made that sound. And my wife, who we've been together for almost 22 years, my wife has learned that I'm just it's almost the same thing too with movies. Like, I sit from a production standpoint, and I'm thinking about the editing, and I'm thinking about the sound design, and I'm thinking about all the pieces that kind of put it all together. So I do wish that I would have studied. I do wish I would have, at college level, university level, put the time and the effort in, because that was really the time to do it. Now isn't for me at this age that I'm at now. But those developmental years, I think, would have made me a different kind of musician than I wound up being. I'm not hating on what I am, but I just, there are certain other musicians that I envy because they have a different level of education, and their skill set is definitely different than what mine is. But that's what makes us unique, right? That's what makes musicians different from one another, and complementary in the same.
I completely understand what you're saying, because I have a certain degree of that myself, in that, I grew up with my dad was a musician. He played guitar and he could sing. I cannot do either of those things, despite his many attempts to teach me. He didn't have the patience. I didn't have the talent. That together was just a very bad combination. Right, yeah. But I grew up listening to all of his albums and all of my mom's albums, and they had very different musical tastes. My dad was much more into rock and the Beatles and the Stones and Zeppelin, and my mom was into more pop stuff. She had the Village People and Laura Branigan and Loverboy and that side of stuff on her record collection. So I was very similar in that I could listen to an album or listen to a song, and I could hear those individual tracks, and I could pick out the keyboards and the drums and the background vocals and the guitar and the rhythm guitar and the lead guitar. And so the same thing, I can listen to a song and be somewhat analytical. And then my years in radio, 20 years in radio, also, I now have that on the radio side of things. My wife gets so pissed off listening to the radio in the car with me, because I'm that guy that when we're driving, I turn down the music, but then I turn up all the station IDs and the commercials and the announcers. Sure, I get it. Drives her up the wall.
I get it. Yeah, right. Yeah, it's. Can I ask you a question?
Mm-hmm.
Did your parents' musical tastes shape your music taste as well?
Absolutely. If you were to go through my Apple Music library, there is everything in there, literally from ABBA to Zeppelin, with several Broadway musicals thrown in just for kicks.
It's probably very similar to mine, because when you mentioned, my dad was a little bit more R&B, soul, and Motown, and my mom was more like the show tunes and Barry Manilow and the pop stuff. So my same sort of thing. If you look through my Apple playlist, it would be, just a smorgasbord of music of different genres and styles. That's cool. It's. I think that's, as I've gone through life, that's a question I like asking friends and people that I meet about how their musical tastes developed. And a lot of it, I think, comes from parents. I have 3 children, so I'm very conscious of what I play for them, with the hopes that maybe, some of what we consider, without sounding too much like my dad did when I was a teenager, what is that junk you're listening to? But I feel like that now, sometimes I'll be blunt, the new music I'm not, I stay very current. Like, I listen to what's going on, but man, it's not music in my opinion. It's really watered down stuff. It's not, It'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 20 years. That's for sure.
I know there is some hope for the younger generations, because I spent I say, again, we're sounding like our dads and our grandpas. There's some hope for the younger generations. I spent several years working for a classic rock station, and the number of listeners that we had that were 18 to 24-year-olds, even under 18, that loved listening to the radio station. And their comment always was, well, I love listening to this stuff because it's real music. There's actual instruments being played. I love listening to the Stones. I love listening to the Beatles. I love listening to Led Zeppelin because there's actual music happening as opposed to just noise. Again, at the risk of sounding like our grandparents.
That's really, really good. During the pandemic, I was hired to be the executive director of a non-commercial radio station. And I'd never worked in radio before. And it was an NPR affiliate, a national public radio affiliate here in the States. And it, the kind of music that was played was the music that made me my skin crawl. Like it was, avant-garde, very, non-thematic. I'm a trained producer. I'm a professional producer that has a set of feelings and instincts of the way that music should sound. Not that my rules are the only rules that apply, but it rubbed my taste. I guess that's the best way to put it. So it was really hard couple years listening to the station music every day. Just, I would do my job running, 50 employees and making sure that, the budgets made sense and the board was happy and all that sort of stuff. But holy cow, when it came time to not listen to the jocks, obviously doing their air checks and stuff was one thing, but listening to the music, I was like, wow, am I at the wrong station? If someone had to say, do you like the kind of music you play? I was like, oh my gosh, this music drives me crazy.
I feel like between the two of us at this moment, we should go out and look for kids to yell at to get off of our lawns after this conversation.
I'm so down. It would be so much fun. Hey, what are you doing? Get off my lawn.
Get off my lawn. Get out of here.
That's great.
Your career is, very long and storied, and you've had the opportunity to work with a lot of big names writing and producing. How did you get into that world of producing music?
Again, the radio was my masterclass. I grew up analyzing songs without knowing that's what I was doing. And I say in the opening of the Docksider show, there's a little video montage about my upbringing, because that's basically what the show of the Docksiders is. It's based in my life. And I was always just mesmerized at sonic wizardry, I like to call it, and how did records sound the way they did. And I was, because I grew up in musical theater and I had such a background in the pop world growing up, melody was very, very important. Melody and harmony, very important. Structure, very important. And I learned from a really young age. I didn't realize I was learning what I was learning, but when I got to be in my early teens, like 13, 14, and I started writing music, I would start trying to emulate songs that I loved. And it served kind of as like the blueprint of how to become a producer. Now, I have tapes and I have recordings and my parents have stuff. They've saved everything that if I go back and listen, I cringe. It's just like, I've tried to be kind to myself. Like if I were sitting next to the 13-year-old Kevin, I would be kind and I would say, just keep at it. I didn't have any access to YouTube. The internet wasn't available. There's so many resources now, and like my first recording studio gig, I was learning how to engineer the way that old records were made. I was an analog console. You had to worry about bringing a sound wave in a certain way that wasn't going to be distorting, or finding creative use for harmonic distortion that the tubes would then help create in the sonic process of figuring out how to make a record sound the way that it did. And then we recorded to 2-inch tape. So I was working a big 2-inch tape machine and trying to really figure out how to make recordings sound like my heroes records, the records that sounded very different. And I remember some older guys that I used to work with when I was maybe 16 years old. I was playing in some bands with some older cats in Milwaukee. And I remember them saying, Sucre's recordings sound like major records. And I always felt like, wow, that was really kind that they said that. And I always would strive to make something sound as great as it could. And I remember playing even like cassette recordings. After I got out of the studio, I had this little 8-track cassette recorder. And I remember CDs were just about coming out. Digital recording wasn't happening yet. It wasn't affordable for somebody to have a home studio, right? You still needed to spend money and go to a recording studio. And I remember some older guys, asking me like, where did you record this? And I was like, in my parents' basement. And they were like, they couldn't believe that I made the music in my parents' basement. And this is the day where you had 8 tracks. So you'd record 3 tracks and then you'd bounce them down to 1 track. And that would free up 4 more tracks. So you could keep layering things. And if you were smart about your arrangements, you would make it so it, wasn't like just a bunch of noise on top of noise on top of noise. So I don't know. It was just I always say that I just had this instinct. I have an instinct when I'm in a recording studio, and I know exactly, like when I produce an album and someone hires me to bring my skill set to the game, I have an instinct, and my job is to coach an artist and bring the best that I can out of an artist, and also be able to talk the talk of what a label's looking for and deliver something that could be commercially viable. And I know that if I get to the point where I get goosebumps, I'm probably in the ballpark of feeling hopeful that other people will also feel that way. But that's what's interesting about music, right? It's very subjective. Things that turn me on might not turn someone else on. So it's always been David Foster, who I've been very, very fortunate to work with a number of times in my career. And I take this very, very literally, but during his shows, if you've ever been to one of the Foster and Friends shows, he says something of the fact of, I only needed to be right a handful of times. And it's very true. Like, you don't have to be right all the time. I think as a young person, you're thinking, to be validated, and you want people to respect what you do, or you want people to pat you on the back and say, wow, what you do is really good. And as I've gotten older, it was never about that for me. It was always about just doing the best I could within myself and challenging myself to always strive to be better from one record to the next, or even one song to the next song. We're working on an album right now with the Docksiders. It's our first album. And I believe I take my past with me. So everything I've done to this point in time will help, make this Docksiders record very special, I think. I'm co-producing it with another amazing producer. And that's something I wouldn't have done in my younger days either, because I felt so passionate about having a vision. To me now, it's all about just doing the right thing and what's best for the project. And realizing that, like you guys in Canada, your hockey team, when you got 2 guys in the penalty box, you're at a disadvantage on the other team's offense, right? You might not have the full bevy of weapons that you have. I feel like the same thing now as I've gotten older. Together we can make something phenomenal. And I definitely want to put people in the room that have like-minded ideas and creative thought processes as well.
It's interesting the point about excuse me, about people have that need, particularly people that seem to be getting into the industry now, have that need to have that instant success. They got to capture lightning in a bottle right away. And I remember having a conversation with somebody about this eons ago, talking about some of the musicians of the 70s and the 80s, and artists like, for example, like a Bruce Springsteen. It took him 4 albums to get a hit, to become popular. There isn't an act around today that would be given 4 albums or 4 opportunities to have a chance to become successful. They get that one single, and if that one single goes to the radio and goes, that's it. They're done. They're gone. They're tossed aside. It's on to the next thing. It's really kind of sad.
It's very sad because we don't know what we're missing. We're not getting artists that could be career artists because the industry won't support it any longer. Interesting point about Bruce Springsteen that you brought up is he got into a really, really big legal battle with Columbia back in the day, and he stopped recording. And that's where he went out on the road. And he said, fine, I'm not going to record, but I'm going to play my music. And he went on the road for years, I believe, and toured and toured and toured. And that's how he became the Bruce Springsteen that we know now, that I go and see him play a 4-hour set at 70 plus years old. And you're like, this guy he's a machine. And he honed his craft, right? It's a skill. It's no different, in my opinion, than a doctor or a lawyer, where they're in practice. Musicians are in practice all the time. The shows are also practice, right? You hope that you've practiced enough to get to the point where when you're showing it to people, that the practice pays off and that your show is memorable. But at the end of the day, I learn more from the shows than I do in any sort of rehearsals, right? Like, rehearsals tend to be just kind of the moments where you're putting placeholders in, but the show is where you learn how the audience responds and the audience reacts. But you're 100% right back to the point of, I sat at Columbia Records in the late 90s, and I got in an argument. It probably was not my best moment, because I was there with my manager who was shopping me to the label, and they had just signed this Sean Mullins guy. He had this rockabye song. I don't know if you remember it.
I'm very, very familiar. I worked in top 40 radio in the late 90s, early 2000s. So I am I could probably recite every lyric from that song right now.
So my point is, that song was the closest to the music that I was doing, because if you remember the 90s, like I do, I hate the decade of music. It's my least favorite decade of music personally. However, because I was still writing pop music, and it was such an anti-pop decade, right? It was not, the big productions went away with the 80s. It was the more stripped down and the more angry you could be. And I was writing songs about love and hope and desire and all those sort of things that, didn't have a place at radio. So I sat in New York City at Columbia with one of the main people. And as we were talking about whether or not there could be a place for me at Columbia Records as an artist, the conversation came up of me saying, if Bob Dylan walked in the door right now, who was a Columbia Records artist, I was like, you guys would laugh him out of this room. I don't care what kind of writer he is. He's an American hero. He's a poet. He's an incredible songwriter, incredible lyricist. But he's can I curse? I almost swore.
No, absolutely. Go ahead. Curse away.
He's a shitty singer. Right? Bob Dylan is not like I get it. Like it's a different thing. Not my cup of tea. And I respect everything that he is, though. Right. So, but my point was, you can't convince me through any salesmanship that if Bob Dylan were sitting here in this meeting today with his manager, that you'd be throwing out a red carpet and saying, we want to sign you. Not where the music industry was in 1998. And they argued with me that, of course, that they would, which I was like, okay, you guys are full of crap. And my manager was like, her jaw was open. It was like, we just ruined this opportunity, buddy. You're like contentious with these people. It was just my way of, I think I was just angry at the business in the 90s, when I really had my opportunity as an artist, as an original music artist, to get my music out in the world. The production sounded great. Some of the songs, were still probably not all that wonderful, but I had some stuff. I had some skills that could have been developed. Like you mentioned, I would have been a perfect artist to have been given the opportunity to put an album out, go tour, get to work with some other people that could bring some other things out of me that I wasn't open to or aware of yet, just because I didn't have that experience. And that's ultimately what I hoped for. But we had moderate success around the Midwest, even at radio. We had some Gavin reporting stations, which are different than some of the other Billboard stations. But we had a number one single outside of Minneapolis and an Indianapolis as well. And that garnered some attention, but it never really pushed the ball over the goal line for us as an original artist. And boy, it was a massive learning experience. It was heartbreaking because it was my dream to be a performer. It was my dream to be, to write my own songs and perform, and it didn't happen for me. But what I didn't realize as I was going through all of that is that my skills in the studio were excelling at the same time, and I became the guy that then people came to because the way that my records sounded were very competitive. And then once we got into the digital recording world, when people started, owning Pro Tools and having studios at home, or even ADATs prior to that, there were like these little VHS tapes that recorded 8 channels of digital audio, which sounded amazing. I'd be the guy that people would send hard drives to and tapes to, and I would mix the records, which is my favorite part of the process. It's the process of just kind of gluing everything together and putting everything in its final place for people to hear it.
I love the idea that a record exec in the late 90s would 100% say that, yes, if Bob Dylan walked in here, we'd sign him, no question. Because I remember when the Idol shows were blowing up at that point, and that would have been early 2000s, I guess.
Right.
American Idol and Canadian Idol. Well, Canadian Idol was later. It came after, was not nearly as successful. But that whole side of the shows were coming out. And I remember having a conversation with one of our local record reps at the radio station and saying, if Tom Petty, Bob Dylan, and Neil Young showed up on American Idol or Canadian Idol, they would be on the blooper reel. They wouldn't even have a snowball's hope in hell of making it past the audition stages. And for anybody to say otherwise is absolute 100% unadulterated bullshit.
100% correct you are, Jeff. Yes. That was like a Yoda answer. I sounded like you 100% you are correct, Jeff. But it's so true, right? Like music became watered down. Music became so formulaic. What I think happened, and they don't talk about this a ton, is in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, artists drove the music business. In the 90s and clearly into the 2000s, into where we are now, into the 2020s, producers drive the music business. So it's very different, right? Art is subjective. Art is creative. Art is, art gives us different shades of gray. Art isn't just black or white. We are now in a world where the producers are so formulaic with their beats and their 8-bar loops that has a melody that spans 3 notes with no harmonic potential whatsoever. The bridge, the glorious C section of a song, is long gone, which is it's the most shameful thing in pop music to me, to get rid of what would be considered, this new moment in a song that takes you to a place that then the chorus then explodes back out of to the end of a song. Like all of these structural changes, and I have a friend that would say radio insisted on this. And what I know is that, radio has their formula too. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to blur, but it starts in the studio. It starts with a producer now that says, I have this beat. Let's get Jessica Simpson or Christina Aguilera or Britney Spears, one of the 3 blonde girls, to sing on it. I say it all the time. I'm like, you could take any Katy Perry song, and I'm not knocking Katy Perry because I loved her show here in Vegas, one of my favorite shows I've ever seen. But you could take any other female pop star right now and put it on a Katy Perry track, and it'd still be a hit. That doesn't make sense to me. That doesn't make sense to the 16-year-old that learned a business that was very different and that gave artists room to be creative, right? Like it's just a very different. I'm not trying to shit talk artists like Katy Perry. I don't blame artists like that. I blame the business, and I blame. I mean, we could really go sideways and start talking about Napster and what that did to change the people in the suits at the record labels. But you know, let's be honest. Like the music industry really hurt itself. They have no one to blame but themselves. Right now, artists have all the reach in the world. The same reach that any record label does. The only thing that I don't have access to that any big record company does is the airwaves, right? And then there's a huge argument of like how much does radio really play anymore into deciding whether or not something's working.
Let's flash forward now.
Yep.
Let's talk Vegas. We've shat on the music industry enough.
Yes.
Let's talk about Las Vegas. How long have you been in Las Vegas? And was it the Docksiders that brought you to Vegas, or did you come for other things?
Yeah. So we moved August 8th of 2022. So we've been here a little over a year. And Tony Orlando is the reason that I'm in Las Vegas right now. So he, long story short, it was Thanksgiving during the pandemic, and I got an email from a gentleman that said, "You don't know me. I'm the oldest living hit songwriter on the planet. Go Google me. Here's my number. I would love to chat with you if you'd like to take a phone call." I'm looking at this guy. It's 3 a.m. I'm looking this guy up online, and I know the name, but I wasn't placing it. And as soon as I typed his name into Google, L. Russell Brown, he wrote "Tie Yellow Ribbon Around the Old Oak Tree." He wrote "Knock 3 Times." He wrote "Come on, Mary Ann" for Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. He's written some of the most classic songs in the world. And he went on like this YouTube deep dive on Thanksgiving night, and he found the Docksiders. And he found a song that I produced that we put out, which was a remake of Andy Gibbs' "I Just Want to Be Your Everything," which is our most viewed video on YouTube. And he said he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Here he is, 80 years old, 81 years old, and he's going, the production's better than the original. The singer's questionably better than the original. He's like, I couldn't believe what I was watching. And he's like, I went and researched the Docksiders, and then I see this name of Kevin Suker, and I found your email, and I just said, you know, he sends me this note. So I call him the next day. We have this amazing conversation. And I said, like I told you earlier, "Yellow Ribbon" was a song that meant so much to me at 7 years old that I wore the needles out relatively quickly on my grandfather's stereo system. And I said, "I'm honored that you reached out to me and said these wonderful things." And he said, "Well, I wrote a song for the Bee Gees that they didn't record in 1977 because they were only recording their own music. I would like the Docksiders, if you'd be interested, I'd like you to produce a song and have the Docksiders do it." And I was like, my God, are you kidding me? Like, send it to me. And it was literally like opening a time capsule. It was recorded in 77, so it sounded straight out of the 70s. The demo singer wasn't all that great. And I got to work on it the day that I got the song. And I started kind of deconstructing it and trying to figure out how we would do it. And I got stuck. And I asked him, I said, "Do you happen to have a song for a female singer?" Because my wife is in the Docksiders, and she's probably hands down the best singer I've ever worked with. And I'm not saying that because I live with her and she lets me stay in the bedroom with her. But I say that because, you know, I've worked with some world-class musicians and singers in my life. And my wife is one of those ones that has a 1 in a million kind of voice. He sends me a song he wrote for Patsy Cline that she didn't record. And I figured it out. The production sounded incredible. That turned into I would like to record "Tie a Yellow Ribbon" because it meant so much to me. Would you maybe introduce me to Mr. Orlando? And I'd like to see if he'd like to guest on the Docksiders version of "Tie a Yellow Ribbon Around the Old Oak Tree." Now, it's not a yacht rock song, but it is in a guilty pleasures world, a song that is meaningful to me and that is kind of easy listening, soft rock for many, many reasons. So he introduces me to Tony Orlando. That afternoon, I had a phone call. Tony, I told the story to, and he said, because this meant so much to you and your grandfather, I'm going to record on this out of my love for my newfound friend Kevin Suker. So he recorded it. I asked him to come to Milwaukee to play with us after the pandemic, and he sat in our hometown show. We did 5 of his hits. He sat in, and the next morning, I was taking him to the airport, and he said, I can't believe what I witnessed last night. He's like, I've been in the business 61 years. The productions you have put together, how you have created the sounds, and what we really pride ourselves in the Docksiders is we recreate the album versions of these records. There are other yacht rock bands that go out really kitschy and wear a bunch of captain's hats, and they all dress the same, or they dress like they're from the 70s, and they do kind of like this tongue-in-cheek. But we go out and I've assembled world-class singers and world-class musicians, and I really feel that our yacht rock project is the yacht rock project in America that people should be seeing. And we've been very fortunate to be seen that way. But Tony said to me, this needs to be in Vegas. How would you like me to take you to Las Vegas? And I just said, when do we leave? And it was,
I'll buy a ticket on your flight right now. I'll go with you right now.
So that was January of 2022. In March of 2022, he and I met here in Vegas, and he had meetings scheduled. We had a handshake deal for the first yacht rock residency in Las Vegas in March. We sold our house in July. We did a 30-city tour in July. It was the most, when I tell you, it was the worst timing ever. We were trying to sell a house. We were trying to pack. We were trying to move. We're playing 30 cities. We had like 3 weeks to get to Vegas and set up to open our show in September. It was nothing short of miraculous that we got through everything and sold a house and closed on the house and packed everything up and moved it. And then it was unbelievable. 2022 was unbelievable. So we've been here a year. We opened it at the Rio and quickly found out that was absolutely the wrong place for this project. And now we've moved to this amazing room on Fremont Street called Notoriety. And we couldn't be happier. We play every Thursday night, which is perfect. We moved here, we were playing 5 nights a week, and found out, those days of Las Vegas, in my opinion, are gone. And a lot of ace entertainers, for a show like ours, would definitely agree. It's and we still like to tour. We have our core business is touring the country. We did 36 cities this summer. We're going out on another tour, which is amazing for us. It's our second tour in 1 calendar year. So we're going back out in December and January again. And then we'll come back in February and open our show back up here again.
The yacht rock thing is really, in the last few years, is one of these things that's really gone kaboom in a big way. I mean, there are radio stations all over the US and Canada that are dedicated specifically to this yacht rock format. And I know like even Sirius XM has a specific yacht rock station, which I don't mind cruising around in the summertime listening to. It's fun to just sort of to put it on and listen to it. So it is really something that has blown up. Is that what sort of inspired you to launch this as a project, in addition to your love for that sort of genre of music?
Yeah, great question. I was listening to Sirius XM in 2017, and I was, I was blown away that there was now a genre, I guess is the right way to say it, or a title for this kind of music. It wasn't just soft rock. It was cooler than soft rock. This is yacht rock, right? Like this is like, you're envisioning, hanging out in the summer in the Hamptons on a boat, blasting Christopher Cross. And I started listening to their playlist, and I was like, wow, the music's really rich. The songs are so well written. The productions are, like I talk about, it's where I come from. The productions are so well thought out and sound so good. And you had to be able to sing and you had to be able to play your instruments. And I was managing. I hadn't been a performer for 20 years. Once my career ended in like the 90s, I transitioned to being a producer, a writer. And then I had this knack of managing artists. I had a knack of getting artists' songs on the radio and putting them in front of 20,000 people on tour and building the careers of artists and being the guy in the back of the room that would fold my arms, just knowing that I had a piece in helping someone else's dreams come true. And I had amazing success, sold a company in 2013, became the CEO of a music company that my sister company was making a movie. And as I'm setting up my company, they needed help on the movie side. They had no contract experience. So I helped negotiate our position in the film. That film went on to win 3 Oscars. So I've had this like just amazingly charmed career that went in ways that I'd never imagined. But it was 20 years since I had been on stage. And I said to an agent of this kid that I was managing, who was playing with some of the biggest girl groups on the planet, Fifth Harmony and Little Mix. And he's this huge agent over at ICM in New York. And I was like, can you tell me this concept? There seems to be a phenomenon of tribute acts that are selling tickets in theaters, like real concerts. And he was like, man, listen, it's a legitimate business right now. There's a demographic of people, an age group that has money. They can spend $50 on a ticket. They can go spend $120 on a meal. And they can go out on the weekends and see something that takes them back and takes them to a place that they remember when they were growing up. And I went, wow, okay, so what do you think of this? I said, I've been listening to the Sirius XM radio station called Yacht Rock Radio. And, you know, Christopher Cross, Kenny Loggins, Michael McDonald, Toto, Olivia Newton-John, Robbie Dupree. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Like, you know, Lionel Richie. There's all these sort of things. And I said, I'm thinking I would be interested in maybe coming out of retirement if I could do it in the level where we were playing concerts. I don't want to go play in bars anymore. I don't want to play like $7 and $10 cover charges where you're hoping 30 people come out. So he said, I know who you are and the quality of work you do. I'm signing you. Go put a band together. And I hung up the call with a deal at ICM for a band that I didn't have together, but I had a concept. And that was in 2017. We played our first show April 8th of 2018. We sold it out because people were just curious in our hometown of Milwaukee. And then the agent had an idea of putting together a limited residency in our hometown where we were going to be playing very regularly to build up this sort of like excitement. And we played 3 shows. And when I mean there were like lines out the door in a city that doesn't really support that any longer. And then he started putting us in like this 8-hour radius outside of Milwaukee. So we were playing everywhere from Detroit to Cleveland to Toledo, Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis. And then the pandemic happened. And everything, as you know, was done. We were done playing. We had started getting this amazing momentum. And we started doing really well outside of our hometown as well. We did what everybody else did. We tried putting together Zoom recording sessions, and we tried to putting together, content that we would pre-record and send to each other and then put it up so people could stay with us throughout the pandemic. What was a 2-week shutdown turned into 2 years. And then coming out of that, imagine a newer band that was like a year and a half old that was just getting off the ground, trying to find a Saturday night in May to play in Baltimore when every other band in the planet was also now coming out of the pandemic was right. Like, oh my gosh, we might've been like, number 1,265th in line for that same date. But for whatever reason, it worked, and we toured right out of the pandemic again. And I'm so Jeff, had I met you like 5 years ago, I was so content being a manager and being a producer. But now having, like, we played 15,000 seats at Mohegan Sun with Tony Orlando this summer. And the video that I have and the feeling stepping out on stage as the leader of the Docksiders and as a singer, which was my dream from when I was 16 years old, it is the most full circle moment in my life. I am so humble and so grateful that I get the opportunity to do this now, in a very different kind of way than I think I would have been at 16 years old had it happened for me. We sit and we meet everybody. I will stay till they kick us out at a merch table because I want to thank every single person, and they want to take photos and they want us to sign autographs. And I'm floored. I'm blown away that I get the opportunity to not only travel the country, making people happy, taking them back to a simpler time of their lives. And truly, our show is therapeutic. We hear it all the time. We hear it from 60 and 70-year-old people that are like, you took me back to 1978, and I haven't heard songs like that. And we pride ourselves. Like, it means a lot to us. That's what we're there to do. And that's why I think the Docksider show is very different than a lot of other yacht rock acts. And I've seen them all. I did my research when I put my band together. But, you know, we blur the lines on purpose. My goal is to put on the best show we can. So yacht rock purists might say, oh, that song isn't yacht rock. And I say, I don't care. I want people to be happy. So if it fits in a certain space, soft rock, it belongs in the Docksider show. I don't know if you know this, and I know you're a very well-educated music guy, but there aren't many female singers in yacht rock. Like, if you really went like authentic, I mean, there's next to none.
Yeah, I couldn't, off the top of my head, I couldn't think of an artist that would fall into that sort of genre.
So I'm going to be really bold here, and I know that they would never admit it, but SiriusXM added Magic by Olivia Newton-John after they heard us doing it. It was not on their playlist, but we were doing it. And all of a sudden, Magic by Olivia Newton-John was on their playlist. But that's what I mean about like the Docksiders. Like we do songs by artists that would be also very well known in that era. And I'm not gonna lie, like I worked with Olivia, and she was the most amazing human being, so kind, mind-blowing. I mean, this is a woman who I had her poster on my wall, you know, as Sandy in Grease growing up, and here I am sharing a turkey sandwich with her, telling my life story about her when we're working together, and she could not have been more beautiful of a human being inside and out, and to get to be able to like have those touch points with artists that I've always admired. And she was so kind about my wife and her interpretation of her music. That was amazing. Just to hear, you know, her say, like, I've heard many people do my music, but your wife is very special. And I was like, yeah, I feel the same way. So that's what makes the Docksiders, I think, really unique, is that we kind of, I don't know if you follow any of these like web sites. There's like this site called Yacht or Nyat, and they've rated songs of how yachty they are or how not yachty they are. And like there's this group of purists that are like, as you can imagine, like with any sort of anything, there's guys that are like, that's not yacht rock and that is yacht rock. And so like, you know, we might get some gruff that we play things that would not be considered yacht rock. But at the end of the day, I want to say, you know, 80% of our set is pretty straight up yacht rock. We have to get a little creative because we have a superstar female singer in the band, and we have to find some songs that she can light up as well.
You mentioned the band. You've got some pretty talented musicians and performers in this band as well, with some pretty pretty deep musical pedigrees and that have worked with some pretty incredible acts as well.
Yeah, our sax player played with both Kenny Loggins and Michael McDonald. So to have him in the group as a featured artist is incredible. You know, there's so many iconic sax solos that were in these songs. And he recreates them note for note, you know, which is it's no easy task. Like these are, you know, some of the guitar parts, like, you know, guys like Jay Graydon and Steve Lukather and cats that played on Steely Dan's records were notoriously, you know, the best session players in the world. You know, to be able to recreate these parts takes a level of skill that not everybody can play. And not going to lie, you know, when you lose a guitar player in a band like the Docksiders, you kind of go, uh-oh, like it's not just like, you know, dude who used to be in a band 30 years ago that can come out and sit in with us. Like the ask is a big ask. Like you got to learn, you got to have the vocabulary and this technical skill to learn songs that these guys were really meticulous in creating. And, you know, sometimes it gets a little crazy in our rehearsals. We're like, it's close, but it's not right. Let's do it again. Let's figure out, we owe, that's what we owe. That's what I feel I owe by putting the Docksiders on stage. It would be really easy, I guess, to go do it tongue in cheek and to be kind of like goofy about the cheesiness that some people could think yacht rock is. I mean, not gonna lie, you know, in the 80s, you know, I was the kid that was like singing Air Supply privately, but like to my buddies, there was no way I was going to let them know I was saying, I'm all out of love. I'm so lost without you. You know, but you know what I mean? Like it was considered soft, and it wasn't the hard rock stuff that my friends were listening to. So, we still find that now and again. So, you know, some people think it's a little cheesy, but we try to take you know, it's hard when you're from Wisconsin to take the cheese out of anything you do.
Sure.
Being a cheesehead.
Listen, there's nothing wrong with Air Supply. Making love out of nothing at all is a legit banger of a track.
You are not lying with that one either. Yeah, for sure.
If people want to learn more about the Docksiders, you guys are all over online. You mentioned you've got YouTube, you've got a website, you guys are on social media. How can people find you guys?
We are simple to find. Everything is just The Docksiders. So www.thedocksiders.com. Great place to find all of our dates. All our tour dates get put up there. And because our fan base is all in, you know, the 50-plus-year-old age range, Facebook is our number one place to find any information. Instagram is also really great. We really don't play in the TikTok world, and we do some Twitter stuff, but Facebook seems to be where our group wants to get their information. So between the website and Facebook, I would say would be the best place to find info on us.
Excellent, Kevin. I could sit here and talk music with you all day long, and maybe I'll have to have you back to do it again.
This would be I think we have an idea for a new offshoot podcast. Jeff and Kevin talk music and get off our lawn. That's what it should be called. Get off our lawn with Jeff and Kevin.
Kevin, thank you so much.
Thank you, my man. I hope to see you when you come to Vegas too. I know you frequent, and when you do, please drop me a line. We'd love to have you out to the show.
And that wraps up another episode of Jeff Does Vegas. If you've got feedback on this episode of the show, or any other episode for that matter, or you've got suggestions and ideas for topics you'd like me to cover on the podcast, please feel free to reach out to me via Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Jeff Does Vegas. Or drop me an email directly at jeff@jeffdoesvegas.com. In the meantime, thank you so much for checking out the show. Be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts so you'll know the moment new episodes are available. And don't forget to visit jeffdoesvegas.com for past episodes and show notes. My name is Jeff, and this has been Jeff Does Vegas, a Walker New Media production.